Hi, this is Carala again. We already talked about regular verbs. Now, en Spanish and in English, entonces hemos hablado de los verbos regulares en español y en inglés. Ok, ahorita vamos a hablar de los verbos irregulares. Los verbos irregulares, excuse me. Los verbos irregulares. The irregular verbs in Spanish and in English. Right? Because I always want to keep the Spanish in mind for those people, number one, maybe who's learning English, but they know Spanish grammar, or those people who speak English and they're learning Spanish grammar. Okay, as a reference point. All right, so let's look at those verbos irregulares. Let's look at the, I'm going back and forth. Let's look at the irregular verbs. Vamos a ver los verbos irregulares. First of all, the word itself tells you irregular. The prefix ir, like in irreverent or irrelevant, can't say it very well, irrelevant, which means not relevant, not reverent, right? Irregular means not regular. And remember I told you the word regular means it follows the rule, it follows the pattern. So when something follows the rule or follows the pattern, all you have to memorize or think about or worry about, if you want to use the word worry, is the pattern. That's what you have to. So if it's the present tense in English, right, all you have to remember is get rid of the to, because the to is the infinitive form of the verb, and then put I, you, we, they, I, you, we, they talk, he, she, it talks. In Spanish, hablo, hablas, habla, hablamos, hablan. Como, comes, come, comemos, comen. Right? Vivo, vives, vive. Vivimos, viven. But if it's irregular, all bets are off. Now what you have to memorize are two things, depending on the verb, obviously. Two things. You still have to worry about the ending. In Spanish, you have to worry about the ending. Not so much. Well, in English, not worry because it's just the S. But what you have to worry about is that the word itself changes. The word itself changes. Now, English doesn't have that many irregular verbs in the present indicative. The irregularity in English is basically in the preterite or the simple past, and the form of the verb, the past participle, which is like eaten, talked, spoken. Oh, I'm trying to give you irregular ones, though. I gave you that one, talk, which is not irregular. Stood, understood. Those are irregular, but basically if you're speaking in the simple past or you're using the past participle of the verb, then you have to worry about, and those are in the perfect tenses. The present indicative is not that bad. Okay, so here I'm going to be looking at basically the present indicative in English. Now in Spanish, no. In Spanish, you have a lot of verbs that are irregular en el presente indicativo. Hay muchos verbos que son irregulares en el presente indicativo. También en el pasado, en el pretérito. También en los tiempos perfectos, el presente perfecto, pasado perfecto, right? So, in all tenses. Right, in all tenses. And that's where Spanish can be a little bit more complicated, but it's just a matter of memorizing. Okay, it's just a matter of memorizing. Every language has its ups and downs. In English, it's pronunciation. Spanish, the grammar can be sort of complicated. The pronunciation is not the easiest, but it's much less complicated than in English. Okay, so let's just look at some irregular verbs in English and in Spanish. Ironically enough, at least for the verbs that are irregular in English in the present indicative, many of the major verbs in English which are irregular are also irregular in Spanish. So here we go. We have a verb. Let me first look at, you know what I did? I did just the opposite. I put this English and I put this Spanish, and it should be this is Spanish and that's English. So let it be noted that I know the difference between Spanish and English, but senior moment. Okay, so in in English, so let me look over here. In English, even though I have Spanish up here, the verb to be is irregular. In Spanish, it's also irregular, ser and estar. The verb to have is irregular. It's also irregular over here, the verb tener. The verb ir, the verb to go in English is irregular. It's irregular in Spanish, ir. The verb to do is irregular in Spanish, and in English it's also irregular. In English it's to do, and in Spanish it's also irregular, the verb hacer. The verb can, C-A-N, when I mean to be able to, is so irregular, it doesn't even have an infinitive form. You don't say to can, because if you say to can, that means to put something in a can, right? So it's just can, like it's just may, just like it's just should, because these are basically verbs, but they're basically auxiliary verbs, verbs that are used to help other verbs. They do not stand alone. Okay, so can and should and may and must and might and ought to, right? But in Spanish, they at least in that respect, they follow the rule. It's poder, so it does have its ending. Where in English, it doesn't have its beginning because you don't say to can. Now, these are verbs that you have to memorize, right? In English and in Spanish, in all tenses, basically. Okay, maybe not in the future, maybe not in the conditional. In English. In Spanish, yes. So in English, I have to show you how do you conjugate the verb to be. I am. This is present indicative. I am. You, we, they are. He, she, it is. Right? And you have to memorize it. And it's one of the most important verbs, so you can't just say, well, I just won't do it. And you just don't say, I to be, or I be, because that's very bad English, right? Now, in Spanish, you have two verbs to be. You have ser and you have estar. Both of them are irregular, right? So it's soy, eres, es, somos, son, or estoy, estás, está, estamos, están, right? And you have to just, if you want to learn the language and you want to learn to speak it correctly, you have to memorize. And in Spanish, there's a lot of memorization, but your mind is fantastic. It can hold the information. It can help you acquire the information, and if you use it enough, that no matter what, it can be, I don't know how many years, once you learn it, and learning means you permanently change your behavior. So now when people are speaking in Spanish in the stores, or somebody wants something from you, you will be able to at least speak the language correctly, grammatically speaking. And that's what you want to do. Whether you're speaking English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, whatever. So, and it doesn't really make any sense for me to teach this. This is something, if you go into our website and get our cards, we have cards on irregular verbs in Spanish and in English, because each verb has its own rule. So we're talking about irregular verbs and how you must memorize them. Spanish has many more verbs that are irregular than English. Many, many, many more verbs, right? And in more tenses. Most verbs are irregular in English in the simple past and the past participle form. Past participle is not a verb tense. It's a verb form. In Spanish, ¿cómo se dice? Híjole, everywhere. En el presente indicativo, en el futuro, en el condicional, en el tiempo, ¿cómo se llama? Pretérito, ¿cómo se llama? Subjuntivo. That's not a tense. Well, that's a mood, but you have to memorize. It's not impossible, but you know, the more that maybe irregularities and things that exist, the more opportunity that you have to say things. There are things you can say in Spanish that you can't say in English because it doesn't fit. And I must say the vice versa. So this is irregular verbs. When I come back, I think we're going to be looking at verb forms. How do you write a verb? So this is Coralla Ficklin McLean at istudyguides.com, PDNs, all our different networks. So thank you and have a good day. Bye.